I thought I saw one very awkward side of the table and one extraordinarily surprised side of the table.
The room is in Saudi Arabia. On one side of the table, the US delegation, the other side, the Russian government delegation. They're discussing how to restart their relationship after years in the deep freeze and how to begin the first tentative steps to negotiating peace in Ukraine. Although notice there's no one from Ukraine in that room. What's going on and what are the implications? We will discuss them on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and we are recording this episode at just about 6:30 on Tuesday, the 18th of February. I just think it's very good to be transparent about where we are in the timeline when world events are moving so quickly. And later on in this episode, we're going to zoom in to one issue in particular that has been mentioned a lot in the last few days when it comes to any future negotiations about Ukraine, and it is the issue of rare earths and critical minerals, which everyone seems to think will be on the table, whatever form the negotiations take. And the form that those negotiations have taken today is Ukraine not being included, because in those talks in that room in Riyadh, it was the US and it was Russia. President Zelensky was visiting Turkey instead. Now, who better to join all these dots for us and link up what's happening now with what's happened in the decades past than the BBC's legendary globetrotter, John Simpson, who joins us now. Hi, John.
Hello. Nice to speak to you.
It was very nice to see you filming your TV show in the front entrance of Broadcasting House today, and even better to now get you on Newscast in addition. I'm thinking you've probably looked at a lot of pictures of negotiations around big tables in your career. What did you think looking at the pictures from Riyadh today with the US on one side and Russia on the other?
Well, I thought I saw one very awkward side of the table and one extraordinarily surprised side of the table. Of course, I may be reading all that into it, but the awkward side of the table, I thought, was the American side. And the amazed, pleased, and still not quite kind of got to come to terms with it side was the Russian side. I mean, you've got to remember that just a matter of days ago, the Russian state, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, they were on the out. They were out in the cold. And suddenly, not only are they back, but they're back in the center, and they're back with only one person to talk to, who today was the Secretary of State of the United States. That is an amazing turnaround, and it's something which makes an awful lot of the United States' partners in Europe feel really nervous about.
And we'll come on to the European angle in a second, but why do you say that the US looks a bit awkward?
Well, I think Marco Rubio is a man who does understand international relations much better than his boss, for instance, much better than President Trump. And I think he knows how awkward this position is. I mean, what's happened is that there were two major concessions which the United States, under normal circumstances, would have extracted from Putin in order to get Putin to the conference table like that. One was to just simply say to him, look, you're out in the cold. What are you going to give us in exchange for letting you back in? That's one thing. And for the other thing is that chief negotiating card that the US had, which was to say that there was no question of Ukraine joining NATO. Now, I mean, in normal times, an American delegation would say, we want Ukraine to be in NATO. And if forced way down the negotiations, they'd say, all right, well, we'll put a hold on that for the time being. Instead, before any negotiations have started, the Americans have given that up. I mean, there's friends of mine, American diplomats, as well as British, French, others, who just think this is a very strange way of conducting business.
And we should just remind people that Ukrainian membership of NATO has been US policy under many, many presidents. It's not just something that Joe Biden invented because of the Russian invasion. Like George W. Bush was pushing for it in the noughties.
That's right. Since 2008, it's been American policy, and it's been everybody else's policy inside NATO too. I mean, one or two countries less enthusiastic about it, but basically it was an alliance decision that at some stage Ukraine should join.
And they papered over the disagreements by having a very long, vague timeline. Right, let's look at some black things in black and white. So we've done the imagery. Here's the actual text. So we got a readout from the US State Department after this meeting, and there's 4 bullet points, and the first 3 are the most important ones. Bullet point number 1: they've agreed to establish a consultation mechanism to address irritants to our bilateral relationship, and then they talk about taking all the necessary steps to normalize their respective diplomatic missions. That is basically code for going back to normal relations and just imagining there'd never been a war in Ukraine, isn't it?
It is. And you can imagine, I mean, I don't know the inside of this, of course, I don't think anybody does, but you can imagine how pleased President Putin would be by that. So from that, I assume that this was a Russian initiative which the Americans agreed to.
And then the second bullet point is to appoint respective high-level teams to begin working on a path to ending the conflict in Ukraine as soon as possible in a way that is enduring, sustainable and acceptable to all sides. And actually, we can now hear Marco Rubio explaining that in his own words, because he did a little bit of a news conference after the meeting. And then, John, I'll get your reaction.
The work remains. Today is the first step of a long and difficult journey, but an important one. And President Trump is committed to bringing an end to this conflict. And as he said when he campaigned for president, and he wants it to end in a way that's fair. He wants it to end in a way that's sustainable and enduring, not that leads to another conflict in 2 to 3 years. That's not going to be easy to achieve, but he's the only one in the world that can begin that process. Donald Trump is the only leader in the world that could initiate that process, and today was the first step in that process.
Now, John, to my ears, that sounds like a process that might be a bit more inclusive to Ukraine than the US has sounded in the last week or so, and maybe a little bit hinting at that Russia might have to give something as opposed to the US giving up lots of things, as you were just describing. What's your interpretation of where we're at with this process?
Yes, I mean, I think that's fair enough. I think that is Marco Rubio saying, look, you're not going to walk all over us on this, and that's important. And of course, that process, the negotiating process, is absolutely essential. I mean, this is not a pro-Russian or a Russian success or something like that. I mean, this is what any negotiating partner would talk about, and they will, of course, have to get rid of all the bumps along the road. The one thing is, as I listened to Marco Rubio saying that, I thought, it's a court, the presidency of Donald Trump. It's a court with a monarch, and you've got all the courtiers, of whom Marco Rubio is one, and there's lots of others. Elon Musk is another, and they're all trying to jostle for position at the moment. So they all want to praise their boss, because praise is one of the ways in which you show your loyalty. So that, I think, is part of it. And the third thing I would say is that Marco Rubio in particular must be very aware that Donald Trump is in a hurry. He wants to get this done by Easter. If it isn't anywhere near Easter, if we're still talking about this in the early summer, then that is not going to look very good for President Trump. And President Trump is perhaps, and this is something that many diplomats are worried about, is going to be prepared to give away things in order to get the speedy process finished.
Now, I'm going to create a bit of jeopardy now, and I'm going to leave the third bullet point for a second because it leads on to the second half of this podcast. So, like, pause the reading out of the bullet points from the State Department for a second. But, John, just my kind of last point to you before we do that is the European reaction. So, we saw that very hastily arranged summit among some European leaders and Keir Starmer in Paris on Monday afternoon. No real definitive outcome from that, although lots of diplomats saying the fact that they met was the victory there for them. How do you assess kind of the European landscape today on Tuesday, a day later?
Well, I'm trying to think of the right way to say a landscape in absolute chaos. I can't think of it.
Yeah, that's a metaphorical challenge.
And of course, the diplomats, tight-lipped, to always say things like it was a success just to get everybody there. In fact, it was pretty disastrous with just about every country. Britain and France were closer than most, but Germany, I mean, the German chancellor leaving early, not at all happy with what he heard. The Polish prime minister saying, we will under no circumstances put boots on the ground in any kind of peace force in Ukraine. Individual other countries saying one thing, thinking others, speaking perhaps with forked tongues. It was a pretty embarrassing performance. And if I were President Putin watching it, I would be rubbing my hands with delight at the prospect of Europe simply not just not speaking with one voice, but having problems speaking with 6 or 7 voices.
I think what's interesting, my thought last night, having recorded Newscast, and it's sort of still all unfolding, my thought once I kind of got home and the dust had settled a bit was it made me realize why Starmer had been so explicit on Sunday night when he wrote his piece for The Telegraph saying he was considering how Britain could contribute troops to any peacekeeping deployment. And I think it was a number of things. It was to look like somebody who was saying yes, as opposed to all his European partners saying no. It was to just create some momentum, and it was to make it look like he wasn't any kind of block in this process. It all makes a bit more sense now when you then see the forces that were ranged against him around that table.
Well, yes, you see, he's got two things to achieve here. One is to show leadership qualities, because that's important back in Britain, but it's also important in NATO politics generally, and indeed with the United States. But the other thing is that he cannot afford to allow himself to go out on a limb with other European leaders in attacking and criticizing Donald Trump. He's got to try to keep Donald Trump in play while at the same time presenting himself as a leading figure within NATO. And that means keeping the European leaders happy. So it's a very complicated thing that he's trying to do. And so far, he seems to be doing it moderately well. But I suspect that's mostly because so many of the other leaders are in such disarray that he looks quite good by comparison.
And it's yet another reminder that negotiating with your own side is the first thing you've got to do, because we've now had comments from Sergi Lavrov from Russia saying Russia wouldn't accept any forces of any nation in Ukraine in any kind of role, whether it was peacekeeping or otherwise. So actually, the negotiations with Russia are a completely different thing from the negotiations with themselves. Right, let's bring me back to the third bullet point then in this State Department readout of the meeting. And this is a really intriguing one, and I'll read it out. And it says, the meeting was about laying the groundwork for future cooperation on matters of mutual geopolitical interest and historic economic and investment opportunities which will emerge from a successful end to the conflict in Ukraine. What a Trumpian kind of business dealy, I've got a great casino to sell you kind of sentence that is.
But, you know, I mean, the word that jumps out of that is investment, isn't it? Because what does Russia need most? It needs to be able to trade again on equal terms. It needs to be able to export. It needs to be able to import. And what the greatest problem that the Russian economy has received over the past 3 years has been the disruption to its ordinary trade. Of course, we know it's continued in many ways. We know that, for instance, European countries, EU countries, have been buying actually more in terms of Russia's oil and gas than they've been supplying in aid to Ukraine. So they're actually helping Russia more than they've been helping Ukraine, even though they wouldn't want to say that publicly. But the key thing that the Americans have is to be able to dangle that idea towards the Russians that they can actually start to come back and get rid of the sanctions, and we can move towards a different relationship. And guess who was sitting by Sergei Lavrov's side? Was the chief Russian trade negotiator, effectively, the man that knows most about trade and is most concerned about trade. So it shows what the Russians want there.
But this is why I love studying diplomacy, because the multiple meanings that exist in individual words. So you interpreted the word investment as lifting Russian sanctions, unfreezing Russian assets, Russia re-entering the global economy fully. I read it as dividing up the spoils in Ukraine between the US and Russia, spoils such as valuable minerals and metals in the ground.
Well, you may be right, although that would, I mean, for that to be correct, that would have to be pretty kind of blatant on the American side's part. I mean, it's possible. I mean, you may well be right. It's clear too. It's absolutely clear that that is what Trump wants. I mean, everybody always says he's transactional, which actually just means he wants something back for whatever he gives. And that is what he seems to want from Ukraine, is the kind of rare minerals and rare earths that Ukraine contains. But I can't help thinking that the real purpose of that was to say to the Russians, look, we're prepared to listen to your interests and we'll help you. Whether it's in carving up something that belongs, in fact, to the Ukrainians, I don't know. You may well be right.
John, thank you so much. And I'll just let newscasters know that they can see the programme you were filming, which is Unspun World, on iPlayer every week. Every week.
And on BBC Two, but that doesn't apply to a lot of your viewers, I suppose.
We're on demand now, John, on demand.
On demand, of course you are. Well, I'm not surprised.
Thank you for listening to our demands today.
Okay. All the best to you.
Hope that wasn't me diplomat-splaining to the great John Simpson there. But I think we just had differing interpretations of a particular word. But let's double down now on my interpretation of that word, investment opportunities, because there's been lots of discussion over the last few days about the rare earths and critical minerals, as they're known, in Ukrainian soil. This is metals like lithium and materials like zirconium and titanium and one called niobium, which actually I'd never heard of before. And this is because lots of people are saying Ukraine has got these things in its territory and they will end up on the negotiating table in some way as part of any deal, whether Ukraine is involved or not. And there's lots of numbers floating around about how much these materials and substances could be worth, just as like there's lots of speculation about who might actually want to get their hands on them and in what form that will happen. Somebody who's spent their whole career studying these rare earths and critical minerals is Dr. Julie Klinger, who's a visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna in Austria. And she was also a contributor to a Radio 4 documentary series on this subject a few months ago. And she's now here on Newscast. Hello, Dr. Klinger.
Hello there.
Is it exciting having the whole world now thinking about your subject area, first of all?
Well, I have to say, I hope it would be under happier circumstances. But anything we can do to help folks think more clearly about rare earth elements and critical raw materials is a good thing.
Well, thank you for helping us today on Newscast. First things first, just explain to us what we're talking about when we say rare earth. metals or rare earth materials. And I was quite surprised because actually it doesn't mean that they're actually rare.
Yes, that's right. This is such an important thing to get right out of the gate. So the term rare earth elements refers to 17 elements of the periodic table, 57 to 71 if you want to be specific, plus scandium and yttrium. That's quite different from a much larger set of metals and minerals that are considered critical. Right. So, for example, lithium, titanium, platinum, these are often talked about as rare or critical, but they're not part of the same family as rare earth elements. And in fact, rare earth elements are not all that rare, right? That's a misnomer that I think has stuck around for more than a century because it's exciting.
And why are they called rare?
I looked into that question myself really extensively. I think the story goes back to the late 1700s when the first oxides were identified in Sweden. And at that time, when they were first identified, no one had ever seen them before. And so they were presumed to be rare. Of course, then geological research proceeded over the next century or so. And the first mention that I found of a chemist lamenting this misnomer is from a journal article that was published in 1907. Rare earth elements are, in fact, not rare. They were believed to be so when they were initially discovered. But since then, chemists and material scientists and specialists in the field know the difference.
Well, I love the fact that us non-experts have been getting it wrong since 1907. That's kind of weirdly reassuring. And then when you talk about critical minerals, what's the real definition there then? Is it critical as in they're very, very important, or critical as in like a critically endangered species? Like actually the definition of rare?
That's a really interesting question. So a number of different countries and political blocs have their own critical minerals or critical raw materials lists. And in order to make it on that list for that particular country or political bloc, that material needs to be crucial to various industrial applications. And it also needs to be part of a supply chain that may, unfortunately, be vulnerable to disruption. So several different rare earth elements are also included on critical minerals or critical raw materials lists, but the lists are much bigger than the lanthanide series that I just mentioned.
Okay, right. Let's go through some of these substances then, and you can just give me like a little pen portrait of what each one is, and then we'll talk about it in kind of in a Ukraine context. You mentioned some of them already, though. What is lithium used for? Why are people so hungry for it?
So lithium is actually not a rare earth element. It's a critical element. And the reason it is a critical element is because it's so important for rechargeable batteries. And these rechargeable batteries are used in just about everything you can think of, from, of course, EVs, right, which are critical for energy transition goals, to perhaps not so critical applications such as disposable vape pens, right? That's another example. And then just about every household appliance or gadget that you might have that has a rechargeable battery chances are that's also a lithium-ion battery. So that's why this material is in such high demand these days.
Okay. Zirconium.
So zirconium is an interesting element, right? Because it's not actually a rare earth element, but it tends to co-occur with rare earth elements. So it's used in a number of different industrial applications for polishing, for alloys, for things that are maybe a little bit less glamorous than lithium, and also perhaps a little less glamorous than, say, neodymium or praseodymium, which are the superstars of the high power magnets that are used in a variety of applications, from renewable energy to defense.
Dymium could be a description of me in this conversation. What about niobium?
So niobium. Niobium is an interesting element because it also tends to co-occur with the lanthanide series, with those rare earth elements. But niobium itself is not actually a rare earth element, even though it is often included on critical raw materials lists. Niobium is perhaps better known in its form as coltan, which is a shorthand that combines columbite and tantalite, which are in fact two elements that are often found together. And that coltan rose to international prominence surrounding revelations and concerns around its role as a conflict mineral in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. But in fact, niobium production globally, I'm pleased to say, is actually concentrated in two pretty well regulated and managed mining operations, one in Brazil and one in Canada.
Okay. And we won't go through them all, but one last one, titanium.
So titanium, this is the superstar of various aerospace alloys, surgical instruments, defense applications as well. And it's used to make alloys that are more temperature resistant, but are also lighter and therefore more energy and fuel efficient. So chances are, if you look at an impressive bridge or a pipeline or an airplane, you're looking at a fair amount of this as well.
Thank you for that tour of the periodic table, including critical minerals as well as rare earths. I was having a very sort of generous description there. Now, in terms of the situation in Ukraine, okay, podcasting isn't the greatest medium for drawing a map, but how would you describe the distribution of these things in that country?
Okay, so the first thing to get clear about is that Ukraine is a large and varied territory. And so like any large and varied territory, there's lots of interesting geology that's happening there. And so at a general level, what I'm saying about Ukraine could be said about just about any other large and geologically varied territory. There are, of course, deposits of all sorts of designated critical materials and critical raw materials, and including some rare earth elements. But lately, there's been a lot of excitement around this $12 trillion figure that was referred to by the US, referring to Ukraine's rare earth reserves. But I think it's important to clarify that according to the best estimates that I've been able to review, this $12 trillion figure actually refers to hydrocarbons, oil and gas and coal, which are not rare earth elements.
So what else should we bear in mind when we hear those numbers being bandied around? For example, I was reading an article today quoting somebody saying, oh, they're actually based on estimates from the end of the Soviet era. They're actually out of date guesses anyway.
Oh, of course. So anytime we see any monetary figures attached to a deposit, we need to be skeptical. Right, because those monetary figures are based on what the price is at a certain point in time. And as we know, commodity prices always change. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that there's a big difference between the estimated value of a deposit that is still in the ground and what it might ultimately become, right? In order to translate that geological deposit into money, the material needs to be mined. It needs to be refined, and it needs to be processed into value-added products, the technological goods or components that we've been referring to. And where that value-added processing takes place is decisive for determining who gets to cash in, right? And so for these purposes, in a much more broader picture, this is why we've seen a number of different primary resource exporting countries around the globe experimenting with ways to get more of the value-added processing occurring within their domestic soils. And this is the case. Whether we're talking about Indonesia or whether we're talking about the United States, right? Capturing that value-added processing is really what translates geological deposits into money.
So basically, if you're just taking the rock out of the ground, it's actually the person that purifies the rock for the actual materials that makes the money.
Precisely, right. And so this is a big question for a place like Ukraine, right? There are scenarios under which developing different critical raw materials reserves could in fact be an engine for post-conflict economic recovery and development. But for that to be the case, the material needs to not only be taken out of the ground in Ukraine, but the value-added processing needs to happen on Ukrainian soil under Ukrainian control. And as far as I can understand it, the proposals coming from the White House don't include any such plans.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. What's your understanding of what Donald Trump thinks he might be getting or negotiating to get here? And I ask that question hesitantly because it's quite hard sometimes to interpret actually the truth of what's going on there.
Well, precisely. And I think experts have to be really careful not to make sense of something that maybe doesn't have a whole lot of in-depth sense to it. So I think my best understanding of this offer or deal coming from the White House is that is that it is a pretty straightforward effort at a kind of transactional relationship. However, it does raise some very serious questions about what the ramifications might be for, say, rare earth and critical raw materials industries that have been doing their damnedest in the United States to get up and running for the past decade and a half, right? Not just in the United States, but in Australia and elsewhere, critical raw material industries have been having a really hard go of it for the past decade and a half in order to get their operations up and running, in part because the price is relatively stable and relatively low. And so if under the hypothetical scenario at, say, billions or perhaps even trillions of additional critical raw materials were brought under production in Ukraine, I think the White House would have to think very carefully about what that might mean for domestic industry in the United States.
Because it could have a depressant effect on domestic production.
Absolutely. And I haven't seen that consideration.
And we should also say, though, that for people who've been paying attention to what President Zelensky of Ukraine has been presenting in his various plans, I mean, he himself raised the prospect of access to these materials a good few months ago. This hasn't just emerged out of Donald Trump's head in the middle of the night last week.
No, absolutely. And I think it comes down to the fact that these minerals, these deposits, hold tremendous potential. Right, tremendous potential wealth. And that's what people are quite excited about. And under a post-conflict development and recovery plan that has that value-added processing happening in Ukraine, in partnership with Western allies, with the EU and potentially the US, it could be a really fantastic and generative economic and political and supply chain stability scenario. But that requires very careful planning. That requires very careful foresight. And it also requires, quite importantly, very careful management of the potential and social and environmental harms that are associated with large-scale industrial production of these critical raw materials.
And I'm guessing from what you've been saying in the last bit of this conversation, you're from a school of thinking that actually countries that have these resources under their soil should be the ones that benefit from it. You're sort of philosophically and politically opposed to the idea of these being extracted in a sort of neo-colonial way.
Well, we've seen what the colonial or neo-colonial mode of extraction does over the past, I would say, couple of centuries. But more to the point, that mode of socially and environmentally violent extraction doesn't lead to greater supply chain security. It leads to greater supply chain and price volatility. And if, in fact, our goal is supply chain stability, then there needs to be much more careful and much more collaborative planning around the extraction and production of these materials.
So an economic argument as much as a kind of moral or historical one.
Absolutely. I mean, the two are frequently counterposed, but if your real concern is geopolitical stability, they're inseparable.
And I'm just thinking, when the invasion started around about 3 years ago, did you think, oh, this will end with rare earths and critical minerals being on the negotiating table?
It's an interesting question because rare earth elements are in fact not rare, that there are plenty of other options for developing rare earth elements and other critical raw materials that have been mentioned with reference to Ukraine. There's always the possibility that these might become a bargaining chip or as they've featured, right? And in fact, as you mentioned yourself, the Ukrainian president has mentioned as a possibility for incentivizing greater investment and collaboration. But there's nothing, I would say, unique about Ukraine's deposits that would necessarily make them feature in the conflict.
Interesting. Dr. Klinger, thank you very, very much.
Okay, thank you.
And you can hear more from Dr. Klinger and the origins of rare earths and why they're so critical for the future of the world by listening to The Scramble for Rare Earths, which is available now on BBC Sounds. And I would highly recommend listening to after this episode of Newscast, which is now, because that's it. We'll be back with another Newscast very soon. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.